Hello. In case you weren't aware, this is actually part 2 of a 4-part series about the DCEU. If you haven't watched the first part yet, I would actually recommend that you do so, not only for the extra views, but also because it helps inform some of my opinions going forward, and also helps establish how I'm structuring this series. But if you have seen that video, or just don't really give a shit, let's just move on to the next movie, shall we? Justice League 2017. Jesus Christ. And here I was thinking Suicide Squad suffered from tonal whiplash, but this? Yikes. No matter what way you slice it, this is just a baffling film. Two very different styles of filmmaking clashing together to bring whatever this film is. Previous attempts at a Justice League film had actually been in development since 2007 with a film called Justice League Mortal, which was going to be directed by George Miller, who was certainly a choice. However, it was unfortunately cancelled around 2008 due to a number of different circumstances, main one being the 2007 to 2008 writer's strike. After The Dark Knight's release and overall success, WB decided to stick with solo projects involving these characters for the time being. That obviously changed with the release of Man of Steel and how they then turned that into the starting point of this new cinematic universe. In 2014, it was announced that Zack Snyder would be directing a Justice League film written by David S. Goyer, which would be the follow-up to Batman v Superman. Chris Terrio was brought in to rewrite the script, as WB was reportedly very happy with his rewrites to Batman v Superman. It was later announced that this new film would actually be 2 films, the first one releasing on November 17th, 2017, and the second being released on June 14th, 2019. Although Snyder later clarified they wouldn't be a direct multi-part story, they would still be standalone stories for the most part. The film began shooting in April 2016, a month after Batman v Superman's release, and it was a little chaotic. Due to Batman v Superman's critical panning, a ton of on-set rewrites were being done, much to the dismay of Chris Terrio. Warner Brothers was becoming more and more dissatisfied with the film, especially as they were becoming increasingly worried about Zack Snyder's involvement on the project and overall universe. The post-production is where this all really started to fall apart, however. The first thing being the unfortunate passing of Zack Snyder's daughter, Autumn Snyder, due to suicide. Snyder left the project shortly afterwards as he just didn't have the energy to put up with the studio and their demands while leaving the rest of his grieving family at home. After Zack Snyder left the project, the studio considered delaying the film. They decided against it and instead hired Joss Whedon to take over directorial duties. This, however, would come with even more problems that I'll go over in more detail later. As of now, I'll just state that conflicting schedules, costly reshoots, tons of rewrites, and strange directorial decisions caused the film to be released in a very strange state, with an overall budget of $300 million, making it the 15th most expensive film to make, although that's tied with 3 other films. This is probably the most apparent flaw with the film. Even someone who barely knows film could probably tell you that Joss Whedon and Zack Snyder are practically on opposite ends of the filmmaking spectrum when it comes to the tone of their films. So naturally, a film that would be a combination of the 2 styles, if not given proper care, will be, something. I think the tone is even worse in this film than in Suicide Squad. The reason being because it seems like Suicide Squad, for the most part, seemed tonally consistent, but studio mandates changed it so much as they feasibly could. It just felt like there wasn't much of a home base to go to. However, this film, there is a home base. It's just there's 2 of them. And they're the polar opposite of each other. I'm not kidding when I say that there's practically no in-between when it comes to the tone of this film. You either have Snyder's darker, grittier, more realistic style, or you have Whedon's lighthearted, sillier, more funny style. While I don't particularly care for Snyder's style, as I've made painfully clear, Whedon's style is so over the top here. It's obnoxious. It's made even worse when contrasted with the Snyder shot scenes. It's painfully obvious Joss wasn't in his element here, and because of that, the final film suffered. Plus, he was also a huge piece of shit on set, so that didn't exactly help much. Yes, I know it's a low blow, but I will still forever think this is hilarious. So in case you somehow don't know, because of the extensive reshoots on the film, it clashed with Henry Cavill filming Mission Impossible Fallout. He famously had a magnificent mustache in that film. Initially, the deal was that if he shaved it for those Superman reshoots, WB was going to have to pay $3 million in damages, so they would have to add a digital mustache for Mission Impossible while Henry Cavill regrew it. However, Paramount stepped in and refused the shaving altogether. This resulted in Justice League needing to be the ones with digital mustache duty. Only in this case it was removing it and Oh god! That's, just... wow. The worst part is when he starts talking, and it just straight up looks like the top lip doesn't have the right muscles. The best way I can describe it is how PS2 characters would talk. They're clearly trying with the mouth movements, but there just isn't enough definition in the model. I should make something clear. I do actually like the first Avengers film, but you can tell it's because Joss actually had a passion for that film. You can't really feel that here at all. I get what WB was trying to do. They were trying to make this their Avengers, so why not hire the guy who wrote and directed it? Well, there's two reasons. Tone, and lack of passion. You can tell in most of the reshoots, it feels like there's just nothing there. The actors look disinterested, the direction is bland and boring, and most importantly, it just lacks the energy of a big-budget blockbuster. While yes, it tries replicating it to the best of its abilities, it fails in a number of different ways. The first thing is, as we now know with the Snyder Cut, it was going to be around 4 hours, or at least an extended cut of it would be. Trying to trim that down, especially to 2 hours, is, let's just say, going to be a challenge. But here's the thing. Almost none of the reshoots actually help guide the plot along. Almost none of them are there to help speed along the main plot. The reshoots are mostly dumb jokes no one laughed at and unneeded side plots. In a film where the original cut is filled with a shit ton of side plots. Like, no, Joss, we don't need to focus on this random family being attacked by parademons. We need to focus on what Steppenwolf's doing, why he's obsessed with these mother boxes, and whatever the Justice League is currently doing. The film was also mandated to be just under 2 hours, so even on top of having to cut everything down to a reasonable length for theaters, it wasn't allowed to be too long.
Here's the weird thing about that. Both Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, the theatrical cut I should specify, were around the same runtime of about 2.5 hours. Both Avengers and Avengers Age of Ultron are around that same runtime. It's so odd because Whedon is clearly comfortable with making films of that runtime, but whatever, the fact it had to be under 2 hours didn't exactly help much.
It's just so annoying watching this film because in comparison with the Snyder Cut, this film was like at most 30% Snyder and 70% Whedon, despite the fact that Snyder is the only one with directing credit. Hell, Chris Terrio, who was the sole credited writer of the original cut, hated this new cut and tried to get his name taken off of it. Unsuccessfully. He shared a screenwriting credit with Joss and... oh boy. Aside from Joss's bad jokes and tone, there's also another issue he had on this film. Okay. I mentioned how depictions like Batman and Superman felt wrong in the last few films. Here, they still feel wrong, just in the complete opposite direction. For example, in Batman v Superman, I thought Batman was basically just the Punisher. Thought criminals were too far gone, killed them with no issue, killed them with guns, again with no issue, and even branding criminals so people in prison would kill them. Something I completely forgot to mention in the Batman v Superman part. But here, he's given the most comedic lines aside from, like, The Flash, maybe? Like, Batman is the last person to crack a joke. He makes not one, but 2 different Aquaman talks to fish jokes in the film. The first time seemed like a taunt, but the second one is a genuine question. Batman, you should know if he can or not. I thought you researched that. Like, the Batman in this film also pisses me off, but for completely different reasons than BVS. How did you manage that, Joss? I already mentioned him previously, but I also do not like the Flash in this film. His jokes are actually the most cringeworthy thing in this entire film.
Like brunch. Like, what is brunch? You wait in line for an hour for essentially
Shut the
brunch.
fuck up, Joss! I can't believe how badly they fucked this up. The Flash should not be that hard to adapt, but this is how they do it? The only character that on paper would seem like an improvement is Superman. He actually smiles and tells jokes and all that good stuff. However, he's still directed like shit. But that could also just be Henry Cavill not caring about these reshoots and just wanting to get back to Mission Impossible. You know, the actually good movie. But it bothers me so much. He's almost there, but it still just isn't quite right. But even then, he's barely in this fucking film. So the improvements you did make are barely focused on. I can almost guarantee you if it weren't for the CGI mustache removal, he probably would have had a ton more scenes after he was resurrected. Also, because this film is under 2 hours and basically has to introduce 3 new major characters, as they didn't have their own films, there's a lot of speedrunning, and you don't get a good sense of who they are as people. I think Cyborg is the worst case of this. Now yes, Ray Fisher has been very open about how much of a piece of shit Joss was on set, but even on top of that, there was only one Zack Snyder shot Cyborg scene in this version. One. Cyborg is probably the least featured character in this entire film, and I'll be honest, from this version of the film, I have no fucking idea what his character is supposed to be. He hates himself and thinks he's a monster in the beginning. Okay. But that very quickly gets dropped. Afterwards, nothing. He doesn't do much in the climax except say booyah, because apparently we needed that. I just can't stand how Joss writes these fucking characters for so many reasons. I can't keep beating this dead horse, but this is probably the most clear example of Joss being on the other end of the filmmaking spectrum from Zack Snyder. Because even not regarding the Snyder Cut for a second, just look at Batman here compared to BVS. What is this? I truly think this color grading is the most atrocious on these costumes. Why does Batman's costume here look blue? Did no one realize this? This isn't what fans meant when they said they wanted a blue Batman. There's only one good thing to come out of this terrible color grading. Okay, so you know how I said that there was an example I had of how to make the Man of Steel suit work? Here it is. I think if the Man of Steel suit was just a little bit brighter like it looks here, it would have been great. Although, I think this one only works sometimes. There's still definitely some shots where it just looks bad. Them also changing the climax from a more darkish blue hue to whatever the fuck this is was also a choice. Because they really chose the most garish red-orange color they could here, huh? Almost everything about this film's color grading just looks awful. I never thought I'd compliment Suicide Squad, but at least there, they still kept the color grading of everything instead of just turning up the saturation to 11 and hoping no one would notice and or care. There's 2 major problems I have with this soundtrack, and it's the use of the Danny Elfman Batman theme and John Williams Superman theme. There's a few reasons for this. 1, switching out the already established themes for these characters for nostalgia bait bullshit. Those versions of the themes are already attached to different versions of the characters. It's not like the previous themes were bad or anything, far from it. So why did Danny Elfman feel the need to do this? I'd say he just wanted to be musically distinct from the previous versions, which is already bullshit, but let's continue. However, he uses the goddamn Wonder Woman theme in this film. So what is it, Danny? Old shit or new shit? Pick one. 2, those themes don't fit these versions of the characters. I already went over how John Williams' Superman theme wouldn't fit this version of Superman, but the Danny Elfman Batman theme I think really doesn't work for this version of Batman. While I think Danny Elfman's theme for Batman is the perfect encapsulation of Batman's character, this isn't really Batman if you ask me. It's made even worse in this film specifically when he's made to be this jackass that cracks jokes nonstop. I also noticed while listening to the soundtrack on its own that there are a few times where parts of it sound almost one-to-one like previous tracks of his. The track Amazon Mother Box has an opening that's eerily similar to the opening of his Hulk theme from 2003. There's also a few points throughout the score that feel like he's trying to do the Avengers theme he worked on for Avengers Age of Ultron, maybe in another attempt to make the Justice League be more like the Avengers. Otherwise, this soundtrack is fine. There's nothing really to write home about. I like the main Justice League theme, but otherwise it's nothing special. No matter what way you slice it, this is a truly baffling film. Look, I may not like Batman v Superman, clearly, but this is a swing way too far in the other direction. What is it with studios and needing to overcorrect in reaction to criticisms for their sequels? I'll give Justice League 2017 a 4.5 out of 10. Aquaman. Another actually enjoyable film in this universe so soon? This could mean it's a lot smoother sailing from here, or... oh god. Anyways, let's not focus on that quite yet. We still have this film to discuss. This is a similar situation to Wonder Woman, where technically a solo Aquaman film has been in development since 2004. However, it had almost nothing to do with the one we actually wound up getting. After Man of Steel's release, and after it was announced that it was the start of a cinematic universe, it was announced after Batman v Superman there would be solo Wonder Woman films and Aquaman films. For this Aquaman film, there would be 2 scripts penned, one by Will Beall and one by Kurt Johnstad, and whichever one the studio liked more would be the one that would move forward into production. Peter Jackson was asked twice to direct this new film. Both times he declined. The reason being that he didn't want to work on any theatrical films unless he was extremely passionate about them. A suspected reason he was asked, especially twice, is his work on the Lord of the Rings films and the world building he was able to accomplish. It was thought he could do something similar for this film in establishing all the stuff around Atlantis. However, who actually wound up getting the job was James Wan in June of 2015. At the time, he was probably more well known for his horror outings, more specifically his work on Saw, Insidious, and The Conjuring. However, only a few months earlier in April, a major film of his outside of the horror genre was released. Furious 7. Not only did it garner positive reviews from both critics and general audiences, but it is still, to date, the highest-grossing Fast and Furious film. It's also the 3rd highest-grossing film of 2015, behind The Force Awakens and Jurassic World at 1 and 2 respectively, and is also still the 13th highest-grossing film of all time. I know it's not top 10, but $1.515 billion is nothing to scoff at. When he was asked to direct a DC film, the studio ultimately gave him 2 options, The Flash or Aquaman. Now, most people, especially at the time, would have chosen The Flash. However, that's one of the many reasons James Wan chose Aquaman instead. He thought that The Flash had been done so many times already, mainly in the fact there was already a successful Flash TV show with Grant Gustin and the one in the 90s. However, with Aquaman, you didn't really have that. At the time, most people, including myself admittedly, still only saw Aquaman as the he can only talk to fish member of the Justice League, so that was another thing that James Wan embraced. He also felt it gave him a bit more freedom because he knew that he could experiment more with it. The idea that he could create a whole new world was also fascinating to him, especially as he'd always wanted to do that in a film. I'll say right now, while I'm definitely curious on what a James Wan Flash film would have looked like for reasons I'll discuss later on, I'm glad this is the choice he made. Not only because I obviously like this film, but I also do agree with the decision he made and why he made it. When James Wan was hired, it was revealed he'd overlooked the Kurt Johnstad script. However, later in November of 2015, David Leslie Johnson McGoldrick was brought in to rewrite the script. However, all previous script plans were abandoned as Will Beall was brought in again to write a new script. Or maybe they just used his original script, whatever. Then, David Leslie Johnson McGoldrick was brought in to rewrite this new script. Again. Jesus Christ. Believe me, if you're confused, So was I, and kinda still am, to be honest. We're honestly getting to a point where complaining about tone is gonna get exhausting, but I feel like I should really bring it up here, and will most likely be the last time I do so, at least for a while. While yes, this film is tonally consistent for the most part, I'm not specifically talking about the tone in the film itself, but more how it fits in with the overall universe. Even though I've obviously critiqued the tone in films like Suicide Squad and Justice League, the idea was clear. It was meant to be a little more serious and grounded. Yeah, this film doesn't do that at all. This is probably the most lighthearted film in the entire universe so far. It's also probably the most tonally consistent since Batman v Superman, of all movies. I also think it's interesting from the perspective of James Wan's other films. While I haven't seen Furious 7, I have seen most of James Wan's other films, and safe to say, this is probably the most lighthearted and goofy of all of them. Again, from what I've seen. It really showcases the range this guy has as a director. I think it's good to step out of your comfort zone, especially if you're a director, and I believe this film showcases that quite well. However, there is a major downside to the more lighthearted tone and why I brought up the previous entries. What the hell happened to Aquaman as a character? Okay, admittedly, if we're just going off of Justice League, there isn't a lot there, but from some of the actual Snyder stuff that's left in the film, he's practically a different character. Now I get it, sometimes a character might change a little bit depending on who's writing them and the overall tone of the story. But these two may as well be completely different people. I know this is a common example, but how the hell did he not know that Pinocchio was originally a book, but so effortlessly figured out the riddle regarding Romulus? The only explanation we get is,
That's my pops. Made sure I knew my history.
it's one of those things where his smarts seem inconsistent. I'm sure they did that so it didn't seem like Mera was doing everything and Aquaman wasn't overall important to the story, but it's moments like that where I'm just questioning what the decision behind this was. Holy hell, Black Manta is such an afterthought in this film. He feels more like a roadblock than anything, and I feel like you'd want to do a bit more with him. Especially as Black Manta is a lot closer to Aquaman's arch-nemesis than Ocean Master. The worst part is this falls into the trappings of a good chunk of MCU films, where the villain might as well just be an evil version of the main character. Now I get wanting to save a more iconic character for a sequel just in case. Hell, I think it's one of the reasons Batman Begins works as well as it does, because it doesn't just rely on the Joker for the millionth time. But the thing about Batman Begins is it didn't have Joker sprinkled throughout and just randomly abandoned to set up the Dark Knight. That is, however, how this film treats Black Manta. I think you either should have had Black Manta from the start, or just save him for a sequel. Or, here's a better idea. Still have the cheesy opening and even the part at the end of that sequence where Aquaman kills Black Manta's father and leaves them both to die. However, we never see or hear from Black Manta again until the post-credit scene. That way, it still sets up intrigue about the future, but doesn't have us question why he doesn't have that much to do. Plus, it can further build upon the idea that Aquaman's hubris can have serious consequences. Also, slight side note, Black Manta's suit looks terrible. Okay, let me elaborate. They almost make the suit work in live action. It is a very goofy suit already, but I'm glad they tried embracing it. But I think there's one slight tweak they could have made to make it better. Make the eyes just a little smaller. Not by a ton, but just enough where it looks comic accurate enough, but not look like this. I think how my dad described it when we watched the film together for the first time put it best. He looks like a Power Rangers villain. I can't help but agree with him here. Because tell me this doesn't look like a Power Rangers villain of the week who'd probably have a voice like this! I'll just be upfront with this. I love the cinematography in this film. This and Malignant are the two James Wan films I fuck with the most when it comes to cinematography. There's two moments in the opening that I think establish really well the kind of cinematography we're dealing with here. When they show a snow globe on a desk that transitions to them on top of the lighthouse, and that first action sequence when the Atlanteans are there to capture Atlanta. Although my favorite shot in the entire film is this oneer that starts off with an Atlantean chasing Mera, Then it goes through a window and moves all the way to Aquaman. I remember when I first saw that shot, I was like, oh hell yeah, this is some great shit. This was the main reason why I mentioned what a James Wan Flash film would have been like, because that would have hit so hard with this type of cinematography. Even aside from all the dynamic shots, there are still some that are just fucking gorgeous. A personal favorite of mine being when Aquaman and Mera are swimming through the undersea trench while holding a flare. It's some great shit, and I'd totally have that as a background on my computer. Holy shit, this film has too much de-aging. Like, okay, the main thing that really threw me off was when they de-aged Nicole Kidman. Nicole Kidman. Okay, I kind of get it because of how often they do flashbacks and you want the characters to look younger, but I don't get it with the actors they chose. Another one is Willem Dafoe. Why? He also doesn't look like he's aged in 30 years. Just, why? Otherwise, the CGI looks fine for the most part. There are definitely still a few sequences or scenes where you're just like, oof, that needed more time. Then again, most of the CGI budget was probably just for the characters' hair for when they're underwater. The soundtrack's alright. One thing I was pleasantly surprised by was the fact that while Rupert Gregson-Williams, the same composer as Wonder Woman, is the only credited composer, there's also a track by Joseph Bishara. If you don't know who that is, he's a frequent collaborator with James Wan, mainly on his horror films. He also composed the score for all the Insidious films, even the ones that weren't directed by James Wan. Of course, it's probably for the scariest scene, that being the trench scene, which I love because James Wan just randomly makes a horror movie for like 2 minutes. On a barely related side note, am I the only one that thinks it's interesting that directors primarily known for horror films tend to make great superhero films? Obviously James Wan, but also a director coming up, Scott Derrickson, and Sam Raimi are the main ones I can think of. I've always thought it was interesting. This has admittedly always been one of my favorites from this universe. Now that might be because it's a little more lighthearted than whatever's going on in the last few films, but there's also just something about it that I quite enjoy. Clearly I wasn't the only one, as this is the highest grossing DCEU film. Somehow. Honestly, I'm thinking the reason why is because it was smack dab in between the releases of Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. I refuse to believe that the fucking Aquaman movie made over $1 billion for any other reason. Like, I enjoy it, but 1.152 billion? I'll give Aquaman an 8 out of 10. Really enjoyable film, even if it doesn't make much sense in the overall universe. Shazam. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is the best film from the DCEU. Now, I might be a little biased, as this was actually the film that broke me out of my DC sucks phase. I skipped Wonder Woman when I was at the height of it, I watched Justice League and Aquaman with my parents, but that was more due to my dad, and I wasn't really foaming at the mouth to see them. However, this was the first DC film since Batman v Superman that I was actively excited for. I saw it opening day in theaters, and I'm so glad I did, because if I skipped out on this one like I did the others, I'm sure this series would be a lot harder of a watch, as it would just be some annoying prick yapping about bullshit for God knows how long. Okay, it already is that, but it would have been so much worse. So, in order for this to make sense, I actually need to start way earlier than I normally would. I've mentioned for previous films how it's technically been in development since blah blah blah, or whatever. But with those, it's because they were ultimately cancelled or were completely different from the final movie. Most of which I never thought was worth noting. Here though, yeah, it's a much different story. Because even though aspects of its development have been changed, there's one major thing that's something that'll become very important later. So, a Shazam film had actually been in development since the early 2000s with New Line Cinema, back when he was still known as Captain Marvel. Yeah, I know, it's a long story that I don't really want to get into right now. It had several screenwriters attached at different points, but the script they wound up going with was written by John August. This was actually put into pre-production in 2008, with Peter Segal as director and Dwayne Johnson in talks to play the antagonist of the film, Black Adam. However, at around the same time, New Line had released a film titled The Golden Compass, which was a major box office disappointment. Time Warner, the company who owns both Warner Brothers and New Line Cinema, decided to merge New Line with WB. New Line would still be able to put out films, but it would be a considerably smaller studio in comparison. I bring this up because it actually caused major shifts in this supposed film's development. The main thing being the major success of The Dark Knight. John August decided to leave the project after the studio wanted the film to be much darker to be more in line with their most recent DC success. Peter Segal still remained as director, though. Even though new writers were brought in, around 2010, the studio considered canceling the film to make it a TV show instead. However, the project would enter full development limbo after 2013, when Peter Segal stated how the film would be difficult to make due to the similarities Shazam and Superman have power-wise, especially with the then-recent release of Man of Steel. However, this would change majorly in April of 2014, with that infamous slate. Not only revealing a supposed 6+ year plan, at least, but also revealing that a Shazam movie was back in production and that it would release in 2019. By September of 2014, it was announced that Dwayne Johnson actually would play Black Adam in this Shazam film. It was also revealed that Darren Lemke would write the script. Around 3 years later, in 2017, Henry Gayden was brought in to rewrite the script. Only a month after that, this film finally found its director in David F. Sandberg. However, there was one final hiccup. Dwayne Johnson was no longer attached to this film. The reason being because Black Adam was now going to get his own film, so now the story would have to change again. Dr. Sivana would be the villain instead. The main criticism I'd like to highlight is the performance by Zachary Levi. Now here's the thing. This is actually very accurate to how he is in the comics. However, in the comics, he's usually around a 10 to 12-year-old, so his much more juvenile behavior makes more sense. Here, however, they make Billy Batson 14, almost 15. But the thing is, Zachary Levi's performance doesn't reflect it that much. Even aside from that, I don't get the sense that this is the same person, just with an older appearance. Not only in the way they act, but also in looks. I mean, immediately the first thing is Asher Angel, who plays Billy Batson specifically, has brown hair, when Shazam has black hair. A weird decision, as Zachary Levi also has brown hair. If you're gonna go for comic accuracy with the hair color, at least make it consistent. Zachary Levi does look like Shazam, but looks aren't everything. In fact, I'd argue it's the performance itself that's more important. Now, I should state that it isn't nearly as bad here, but it does feel like there was a little bit lost in translation here. It feels like maybe there wasn't enough preparation between Asher Angel and Zachary Levi. Like, I know some actors do their own prepping separate from everybody else, but this is one of the few times where they really should have done it together, especially as they're playing the same character, essentially. This has always bothered me since this first came out. The 7 deadly sins are barely distinguishable. Apparently they drew a lot of inspiration from the terror dogs from Ghostbusters, and I can definitely see that. However, there's really only 2 I can immediately pick out in a group shot: gluttony and envy. Aside from that, I only know which one is pride because of a DLC tie-in level in LEGO DC Supervillains where you can play as him. Greed is given a brief mention in the scene where he kills Savannah's dad. Everyone else? Fuck if I know. I can never tell which one is supposed to be lust, sloth, or wrath. You want to know the saddest part? I'm sure you didn't either until just now, because I actually swapped the pictures. This is wrath, and this is sloth. So you're telling me in the film that is trying to embrace its comic book silliness, this is the best visual distinction it's got? You couldn't at least make them different shades or something? Or better yet, make them slightly different colors. Like Pride's purple, Envy's green, Wrath's red,
and so on and so forth.
Because it is really hard to tell what's happening at times because they aren't visually distinct enough. This is made even worse during the film's climax when the constant cutting back and forth isn't helping matters. Not to mention, even if it's not design, we don't really get enough of how they fight or whatever to piece together which one is which either. Like, here's one I thought of just now. Because Sloth is, well, Sloth, make it so he either ignores doing certain tasks or does things in the laziest way possible. Is it boring and predictable? Yeah. But it's also something that ties into their nature. I feel like they just aren't given enough screen time, especially if the point is that they're using Savannah and nothing more. Don't get me wrong, there was a part of me that was incredibly curious to see where this would go. However, as we'll see later, they kind of wrote themselves into a corner with this because now, these other characters that didn't have much before the climax now have to have a shit ton of screen time for the next film because, well, you can't just ignore them now, and most of them barely have personalities. I especially feel like it's a wasted opportunity with Freddy getting powers. Throughout the entire movie, there was this growing conflict between Billy and Freddy on how to use Shazam, and it starts driving a wedge between them. It does feel a little anticlimactic when he actually does get powers, as there was a part of me that thought we would start to see him abuse his powers like Billy did. Also, slight nitpick, these guys seem to have a better grasp on how to use their powers than Billy in far less time. Like, okay, I get Freddy as he's been spending all this time with Billy, and he'd know what he'd be capable of with these powers. But the others don't really know that. I get it makes for a more epic climax, but we just spent a whole movie on this kid learning how to use these new powers, and these other kids figured it out in like 10 minutes. Yes, I know that I said I wouldn't mention tone anymore, but it's something that's always stuck out to me, even when I first watched this. This film does have some tonal issues. Now, it's not nearly to the degree of Suicide Squad or Justice League, but there are still very much some issues here. The main thing that, while this movie is very lighthearted and fun for the most part, there are multiple scenes that are borderline horrific. Like, I immediately knew something was off when that one researcher lady fucking disintegrated after touching the door. Then again, when Savannah killed those board members with the 7 deadly sins. Yeah, it wasn't on screen, but even without that, the way it's shot and the sound design is supposed to evoke a feeling of horror. Now don't get me wrong, I fucking love horror films. But I obviously like horror films for different reasons than I like superhero films, and this doesn't really feel like a good blend of the two. It was also very infrequent when they did it. I appreciated the trench scene in Aquaman so much because it was really the only time in the film where James Wan went to his horror roots. This film does it a few times, but it's not enough to actually justify it, if that makes sense. I feel like if there were more scenes like that with the 7 deadly sins, it would have been cooler. Hell, there's another thing that really helps make my point about tone, and it's... The composer of this film is Benjamin Wallfisch. If you don't know who that is, there might be a chance you've heard some of his music. I personally was introduced to him through the 2021 Mortal Kombat film, but he primarily does horror stuff from what I've seen. He's collaborated with David F. Sandberg on every single one of his films. He did both It films, worked on Leigh Whannell's The Invisible Man, Alien Romulus, and a stacked year this year with Leigh Whannell's Wolfman, Predator, Killer of Killers, Conjuring 4, and Mortal Kombat 2. Wallfisch was inspired by John Williams and scores from 80s Amblin Entertainment films, not only to evoke a feeling of whimsy that those scores tend to bring, but also, using his own words here, picturing what might happen if a 14-year-old was put in front of a 100-piece orchestra and told there were no limits. While there is a part of me that understands that sentiment, there's also the fact that some of the tracks in this film sound straight out of a Conjuring movie. I feel like some of the tonal inconsistencies are the most apparent if you just listen to the soundtrack, especially when, in the same track, you'll go from warm and fuzzy to loud and terrifying. Otherwise, the score was fine. I'm surprised how few listens it has on Spotify, but I'll also admit I'm the weirdo that unironically listens to film scores, so I don't know why I'm so surprised. For what may as well have just been a superhero version of Big, hell, they even got the big floor piano in there, this was quite a fun film. As stated before, this film got me out of my DC sucks phase, and I can't be more glad about it. While it definitely still has its issues, as I've unfortunately made abundantly clear, it's still, to this day, my favorite DCEU film. I think even behind its fun exterior, the heart of the film is very good. I think that's why I fell in love with it. Not because, oh, it's wacky and goofy! but because this one actually feels like there's this warm, fuzzy feeling, unlike most DC projects that have felt overly dark just for the sake of it. I'll give Shazam a 9 out of 10. It's still fun to this day, one of the few DCEU films I rewatch every now and again. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's the only one I've seen more times outside of DCEU rewatches like this. Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn. Okay, first of all, this is a goddamn mouthful of a title. I know it's already been mentioned, but holy hell. Okay, I get it. It's very much in character for Harley Quinn to call it some shit like that. But sometimes there just has to be a limit. Other than that, yeah, this seems fine. Not great or anything, but at this point I think I'm starting to lower my standards for this universe. I immediately knew something was wrong when I checked the Wikipedia page for this, out of curiosity, and saw that this film only had 2 paragraphs for the development, unlike the other films in this franchise, which had 4 on average. So note that I probably won't have much to say in this portion. In May of 2016, 3 months before the release of Suicide Squad, it was announced that there was going to be a spin-off film focusing on Harley Quinn, Batgirl, and some of the other Birds of Prey. Margot Robbie would also be producing the film. Later that year, it was announced that Christina Hodson would be writing the script. However, it wasn't until 2018 when a director was finally found. Her name was Kathy Yan. This is her second, and as of when I wrote this, only other feature film aside from her first film, Dead Pigs. Some of the only other things I got is, apparently Penguin was supposed to be in this film, but they removed him as he was supposed to be in The Batman, when it was still supposed to be about Ben Affleck and not Robert Pattinson. It also dropped Batgirl because of her own film that was being developed at the time. Well, that sucks. Yeah, that's the best I got. Sorry, guys. You'd think with the way the title is set up, Harley Quinn would be more of a side character, and her name's really only on the poster for marketability. But nope, she is the main character. The weird thing, Margot Robbie kept insisting this wasn't a Harley Quinn solo film, when, ironically, the rest of the Birds of Prey kind of feel like an afterthought, especially Huntress. So my question is, why even call it Birds of Prey at this point? Especially when the film focuses on them so little in comparison to Harley Quinn. I'd understand it a little bit more if it wasn't just 3 of the members. Seriously, the team in the comics is weirdly large, and that's not even counting all the former members. There's not many characters that you have to set up. The film's job is just to make us care about them. Yet, when they team up at the end, it doesn't feel earned or even natural. It also doesn't help that Huntress literally admits to joining them because she can, and also, she doesn't want to get killed by Black Mask. Hell, these characters barely interact before the 3rd act. In fact, I think the 3rd act was when the rest even met Huntress right after she killed Victor Zsasz. There's no connection between the members at all, and for a film that claims to be a team film, this does a shit job at it. This could have just been a solo Harley Quinn film, and it probably would have been fine. Hell, maybe even make this film a backdoor pilot or some shit to an actual Birds of Prey film. I mean, this film already tried that, but you know what I mean. Look, I love Ewan McGregor. He's the one reason I don't feel completely dead inside watching Phantom Menace or Attack of the Clones. But I can't tell if he was just miscast, given a bad script, or given bad direction. I don't want to say all 3 because I feel like he could have been a great Black Mask. But yikes, what happened here? You can tell he's just having a ton of fun in the role, really leaning into the sadistic nature of this character and finding these horrible situations hilarious. But this wasn't the right role for that. I think the worst part is just the fact he's supposed to be playing Black Mask. I feel like he's a character that could have worked even with this kind of more lighthearted tone. In fact, I think he'd thrive in it because of it. He would contrast really well with the rest of the film. It would really establish just how much of a threat he can be. However, he's arguably the goofiest part of the film. Literally his first scene showing one of his horrible acts when he tells one of his goons to cut off someone's face, it's treated like a joke. I especially knew how goofy he was when he was talking to Zsasz about trying to hire Huntress and was just like,
"Why don't I own the crossbow guy?
You should own it.
I mean, I like crossbows."
Like, it's just so out of place. It also means that when he does try to be threatening, it doesn't work as well. Also, slight nitpick, Ewan is not doing a good job at hiding his accent in this film. There's some scenes where he sounds fine, but then there's others where he can't decide if he's American, Scottish, or British. Now yes, this was bound to happen as the Harley Quinn comics are very similar to the Deadpool comics in several ways. But this film is very similar to the Deadpool movie, which is interesting. The main way that I could tell, this has a very similar story structure to the original Deadpool. That being, there isn't one, really. It keeps cutting all over the place, which is supposed to reflect the character's scatterbrained personalities, but it's almost in the exact same ways. It also doesn't help that this is the only film in the entire DCEU where Harley Quinn breaks the fourth wall. Now, most of the time, it's in the form of narration, which, fine, whatever, that's quite common. But she actually talks to the camera not once, but twice. So not only does it never come up again, but it also really doesn't help the comparison. Hell, both films even slightly make fun of you for waiting for a post-credit scene. Although Deadpool's is a reference to Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and this one's just Harley narrating a dumb joke that gets cut off. This score was done by Daniel Pemberton. If you don't recognize the name, you'll probably recognize some of the music he's made, mainly for the Spider-Verse films. This score's fine. You can definitely tell that it was composed by him and how some of it sounds very reminiscent of Spider-Verse. I found this was most apparent in the track named Harley Go-Go A Go-Go, where it sounds almost like one of the chase themes from Into the Spider-Verse. Overall, this film was just okay. I remember really liking it the last 2 times I saw it, but now, I don't know. This film's just so interesting to look at for several reasons, but when you watch it alongside some of these other DCEU films, it's such an anomaly. Like how it's to date the only one of 2 theatrically released R-rated DCEU films. No, the Ultimate Edition of BVS and the Snyder Cut don't count, as they didn't get theatrical releases initially. I'll give Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn a 6.5 out of 10. Not amazing, but I've certainly seen worse. That concludes part 2 of this 4-part series about the DCEU. I know I said that I was going to get this out in 2 to 3 weeks, and obviously as of now, it's been a lot longer than that. I apologize for that. That's why I said don't quote me on that at the end of the last part. Before I get on to making part 3, though, I'm probably going to go back to my Star Wars series, as I already have the script written out for the next part of that, and I'm still working hard on the finale of that series, because, well, obviously, I'm very passionate about Star Wars. Yeah, so I don't know when either of those are going to come out. Hopefully soon. Yeah. So, I thank you for listening to my yapping, and I'll see you next time.